My own children looked at me across the glass table like I was a piece of broken furniture to be thrown out. They sat there in their $1,000 suits, telling me I was too old, too slow, and too obsolete to run the empire I built with blood and diesel. They thought they were seizing the throne. I didn't sign that retirement paper because I was weak. I signed it to trigger the only trap that could save their lives from the monsters they didn't even know existed. But before I show you the wreckage, take a breath. This isn't a story about winning, it's a lesson in survival. Let's get into it. My name is Elijah Thorne. I am 72 years old, and to understand why I did it, we have to go back to the moment the air in the boardroom turned cold.
The boardroom air was recycled, cold, and scrubbed of anything living. It smelled of industrial lemon polish and the sharp ozone tang of laser-printed spreadsheets. I sat at the head of the table, though the chair felt different today, less like a seat of authority and more like the waiting bench at a bus station. My hands rested on the glass surface. My knuckles were swollen, arthritic maps of 72 years of labor, loading docks, frozen steering wheels, and the vibration of diesel engines. Against the pristine, tempered glass, they looked like foreign objects. Opposite me sat Caleb, my son. He was wearing a suit that was a shade of blue I'd never seen on a worksite. Italian wool, cut slim, tight at the shoulders. It cost more than the first 3 trucks I bought back in '82. He was standing, pacing the length of the room, gesturing with a manicured hand towards the projection screen. "It's about evolution, Dad," Caleb said. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall, at the graph that showed a red line dipping slightly in the third quarter. "The logistics landscape is shifting. We need agility. We need synergy between the digital front end and the physical fulfillment." Synergy. The word tasted like aluminum foil in my mouth. I remembered when Caleb was 6, crying because he scraped his knee on the sidewalk. I told him to stand up and check for broken bones. Now he was telling me about synergy while trying to break my back. To my right, Simone sat like a statue carved from ice and ambition. She was checking her watch, a Cartier tank, silver, understated, expensive. She tapped her pen against the glass table. Tick, tick, tick. It was a rhythm of impatience. She wasn't listening to Caleb. She already knew the script. She was just waiting for the execution.
"The numbers don't lie, Elijah," she said. It was a calculated move, a distancing tactic. She wasn't my daughter right now. She was the chief financial officer. "The operational overhead on the legacy routes is drowning us. We're holding on to assets that depreciate daily. We need a leadership team that speaks the language of the modern market." I remained silent. I turned my head slowly to look out the floor-to-ceiling window. We were on the 30th floor. From here, the trucks down on the highway looked like toys, like the die-cast models Caleb used to line up on the living room rug. They didn't look heavy from up here. You couldn't smell the exhaust or feel the heat of the transmission through the floorboards. That was their problem. They thought the map was the territory. "You're quiet, Dad," Caleb said, finally turning to face me. He stopped pacing. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tic he'd had since high school. "We expected resistance. You expected me to yell," I said. My voice was low, gravel rolling in a cement mixer. "You expected the old man to pound the table and talk about the good old days." Caleb exchanged a look with Simone, a quick conspiratorial glance. "Manage the asset. De-escalate." "We just want what's best for you," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave into that practiced, compassionate tone doctors use when they tell you the cancer is terminal. "You're tired, Dad. You've been carrying this weight for 40 years. Mom is gone. The house is empty. Why keep fighting the tide? Let us handle the burden. Let us take the weight." The weight. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the soft jawline hidden by a carefully trimmed beard. I saw the eyes that had never stared down a union rep in a rainstorm or negotiated a passage fee with men who didn't carry business cards. He thought the burden was the quarterly earnings report. He thought the weight was the stress of managing a fleet of 200 trucks. He didn't know about the Tuesday night route. He didn't know about the secondary ledger kept in the safe that only opened with a physical key. He didn't know that the reason our trucks never got stopped at the state line wasn't because of his digital optimization, but because of a handshake I made in 1995 with a man named Mr. Gray. They were children playing in a minefield, convinced they were gardening. "The vote has been called," Simone said, cutting through the silence. She pushed a folder toward me across the glass. It slid smoothly, stopping inches from my hand. The board has already ratified it, pending your signature on the transition agreement. It's a unanimous decision, Elijah. Even your old friends on the board, they see the writing on the wall. I looked at the folder. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock. Legacy Transition Protocol, it said on the front. My old friends, I said, a dry chuckle escaping my chest. You mean Henderson and Miller? The ones whose grandkids you just put through private school with the dividends? Simone didn't blink. It's business. It's gravity, I corrected. Things fall. I reached into my jacket pocket. I felt the familiar cold metal of my fountain pen. I didn't pull it out yet. I just held it. If I sign this, I said, looking at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight hitting the table. They swirled in chaotic patterns, driven by currents we couldn't see. If I sign this, I am fully divested. No operational control, no oversight, no liability. Complete indemnification, Caleb said eagerly, sensing the victory. You walk away clean. Full pension, the buyout package, the title of Chairman Emeritus. You just rest. And the routes? I asked. The schedules? We're revamping everything, Caleb beamed, pulling up a new slide. It showed a spiderweb of efficient, straight lines. AI-driven logistics. We'll cut fuel consumption by 12% in the first quarter. We're phasing out the Tuesday runs. They're inefficient. Too much deadhead mileage. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. The Tuesday runs. The lifeline. You're canceling the Tuesday runs? I repeated. Inefficient, Simone said, tapping the pen again. Tick. We're bleeding money on them. I looked at them. My blood. My legacy. They were smart. They had MBAs. They had algorithms. But they had no wisdom. They were about to sever the artery that kept the beast fed. The beast didn't eat fuel. It ate respect. And it ate on Tuesdays. If I fought them, if I refused to step down, they would drag me into court. They would declare me senile. They would expose the books to forensic accountants to prove my mismanagement. And then the FBI would find the other ledger, and we would all go to prison. Or worse, the silent partners would get nervous, and when they got nervous, they didn't file lawsuits. I realized then that there was only one way to save them. I had to let them destroy themselves just enough to see the truth, but not enough to die from it. I had to let the wall fall so they could feel the wind. I pulled the pen from my pocket. It was heavy, black lacquer with gold trim, a retirement gift from the Teamsters 20 years ago. You're right, I said. Caleb blinked. He hadn't expected surrender. I'm glad you see it that way, Dad. I am tired, I lied. The words tasted like ash. And the world has changed. I opened the folder. The paper was bright white, blinding in the sun. I didn't read the terms. I knew what they were. They were an eviction notice from my own life. I uncapped the pen. The nib was sharp. One condition, I said, hovering the pen over the signature line. Name it, Caleb said, generous in his triumph. Do not sell the warehouse on 4th Street. Lease it out if you have to, but keep the title. Simone frowned. That property is a sinkhole. The land value alone. Keep the title, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. Or I tear this paper up and make you drag me out by my hair. They exchanged looks again. Simone shrugged. A minor concession. Fine, she said. We keep 4th Street. I signed. The ink flowed dark and permanent. Elijah Thorne. I capped the pen and placed it on the folder. I pushed it back toward them. The sound of the paper sliding on the glass was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Done, I said. Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding. He smiled, a wide, boyish grin that didn't reach his eyes. You won't regret this, Dad. We're going to take the company to the moon. I stood up. My knees popped. I felt lighter, and yet terrified. The moon is a vacuum, Caleb, I said, buttoning my jacket. There's no air to breathe up there. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I didn't look back. I could hear them shuffling papers, the excitement buzzing between them like static. They were unchaining a beast they didn't even know existed, and they were doing it with a smile. I walked out into the hallway, the plush carpet silencing my footsteps. I needed to make a phone call. Not to my lawyer, to the burner phone taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. I had to warn the darkness that the lights were about to go out. Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding. He smiled, a wide, boyish grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You won't regret this, Dad. We're going to take the company to the moon." I stood up. My knees popped. I felt lighter, and yet terrified. "The moon is a vacuum, Caleb," I said, buttoning my jacket. "There's no air to breathe up there." I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I didn't look back. I could hear them shuffling papers, the excitement buzzing between them like static. They were unchaining a beast they didn't even know existed, and they were doing it with a smile. I walked out into the hallway, the plush carpet silencing my footsteps. I needed to make a phone call. Not to my lawyer, to the burner phone taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. I had to warn the darkness that the lights were about to go out. The transition from the boardroom to my private office was a short walk, but it felt like crossing a border between two hostile nations. The boardroom was their territory now, glass, steel, transparent. My office was still mine. It was a fortress of dark oak, leather that smelled like tobacco and age, and filing cabinets that held the weight of 40 years. Caleb and Simone followed me in. They didn't sit, they hovered. They were vultures circling a carcass that hadn't quite stopped breathing. Simone carried the exit package. She placed it on my desk, a slab of solid mahogany that I'd bought from a bankrupt shipping magnate in the 90s. The wood was scarred, stained with coffee rings and ink, a topographical map of crises solved and deals struck. The packet she slid across it was pristine, bound in a blue folder that felt too smooth, too synthetic. "Standard separation agreement," Simone said, her voice clipped. She was already mentally redecorating this room. I could see her eyes darting to the heavy velvet drapes, calculating how much light they blocked. "We've expedited the vesting schedule. You keep the health benefits, obviously, and the car." I sat down. The leather chair groaned, a familiar sound of protest. I didn't open the folder immediately. I ran my hand over the cover. "And the liability?" I asked. "Fully addressed," Caleb said. He was leaning against the doorframe, checking his phone. He couldn't wait to tweet about the new era. "We're shielding you, Dad. It's a clean break." I opened the folder. The pages were dense with legal script, the kind of language designed to obfuscate rather than clarify. I put on my reading glasses, not because I needed them to see, but because it made them wait. I turned the pages slowly. The silence in the room stretched thin. I found it on page 14, Section 8, Paragraph C, the Total Indemnification Clause. It was a beautiful paragraph, a masterpiece of corporate absolving. It stated in no uncertain terms that upon my signature, the new executive board, Caleb and Simone, assumed full legal, financial, and operational responsibility for all existing contracts, shipping manifests, and logistical agreements, known or unknown. It explicitly released Elijah Thorne from any future litigation regarding the company's operations. They thought they were protecting me from slip-and-fall lawsuits or a disgruntled shareholder. They didn't know they were signing a confession to the federal government and a suicide note to the Syndicate. I tapped the paper with a callous-hardened finger. The sound was dull against the thick stack. "This clause," I said softly, "it covers everything? Even the specialized inventory?" Caleb pushed off the doorframe, an exasperated sigh escaping him. "Dad, we went over this. Specialized inventory, legacy routes, the Tuesday run, it's all absorbed. We're auditing the entire system. If there's anything non-compliant, we'll fix it. That's what the indemnification is for, so you don't have to worry about the cleanup." "The cleanup," I repeated. I looked up at him. He looked so confident, so terribly young. "The logistics are heavy, Caleb. There are silent partners who require specific handling. They do not respond well to audits. They do not fill out spreadsheets." Caleb laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Jesus, Dad, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. Silent partners. Who are we talking about? The union reps? The local zoning board?" "Men who value silence," I said. "Men who pay in cash and expect the Tuesday truck to leave the dock at 11 p.m. without inspection." Caleb walked over to the desk, placing his hands on the edge. He leaned in, invading my space. He smelled of expensive mints. "You're a hoarder, you know that," he said, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. A Depression-era hoarder of control. You think because you built this place with a wrench and a roadmap that it's some kind of mystic temple. It's a shipping company, Dad. We move boxes from point A to point B. There is no mystery. There are only inefficiencies. He stood up straight, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. You held on to the secrets because they made you feel necessary, but we don't need secrets. We need transparency. I looked at Simone. She was staring at the floor, tapping her foot. She knew something was off. She had a head for numbers, and the numbers on the legacy routes likely never added up. But she wanted the chair more than she wanted the truth.
Simone, I asked. Just sign it, Dad, she said, finally meeting my eyes. Her gaze was cold. Take the money. Go to the lake house. Let us do our jobs. I looked back down at the paper. Transparency. That's what they wanted. They wanted to turn on the lights in a cellar where things grew that died in the sun. If I didn't sign, I was liable. If I didn't sign, when the partners found out the route was canceled, they would come for the man in charge. If that man was me, I would have to deal with Mr. Gray. I would have to make the calls, pay the blood money, and keep the rot hidden for another decade. But if I signed, I was retired. Legally, irrevocably. The partners followed the chain of command. If the shipment stopped, they wouldn't look for the old man in the garden. They would look for the CEO. I reached for my fountain pen. It lay on the desk like a dormant weapon. I unscrewed the cap. The threads turned smoothly, a precision instrument. I looked at the gold nib. "You are certain?" I asked one last time. "You want the full burden?" "Give us the pen, Dad," Caleb said. "We'll write the future." "The future," I muttered. "God help you." I lowered the pen to the paper. The ink flowed black as a river at midnight. It soaked into the fiber of the page, binding me to my freedom and them to their catastrophe. I signed my name with a steady hand, Elijah J. Thorne. The loop of the E was sharp, the line of the T like a roof beam. I dated it. I capped the pen. The click echoed in the room like the hammer of a revolver falling on an empty chamber. I slid the folder back across the mahogany. Caleb snatched it up instantly, checking the signature as if he expected me to have written, "Help me," instead of my name. He smiled, a genuine predator smile. "There," he said. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" "No," I said, standing up. "The hard part is over for me." I looked around the office, the books on the shelves, manuals on structural engineering, maritime law, and 3 hollowed-out volumes that used to hold emergency cash. I wouldn't need them. "I'll need an hour to collect my personal effects," I said. "Take your time," Simone said, her voice softening now that the deed was done. She was already mentally measuring the wall for a flat-screen monitor. "We have a transition meeting with the department heads in 10 minutes. You don't need to be there." "No," I agreed. "I don't." They turned to leave, clutching the folder like a holy text. Caleb paused at the door. "We're going to make you proud, Dad. You'll see. By next quarter, you won't even recognize this place." "I'm counting on it," I said. They left. The heavy door clicked shut. I stood alone in the silence of the office. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone. I looked at the empty spot on the desk where the folder had been. The indemnification was my shield, but it was also my sentence. I had just fed my children to the wolves. I didn't feel guilt, not yet. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a man who has just cut the rope to save the rest of the climbing team, knowing the ones falling are the ones who insisted on leading. I moved to the filing cabinet in the corner. It was locked, but not for long. I had the Rolodex to retrieve, and the burner phone taped under the bottom drawer. The clock had started ticking. I had maybe 48 hours before the Tuesday route was missed, before the inefficiency Caleb despised became a very literal dead weight. I pulled the bottom drawer open. It stuck, just a little, like it always did. I reached underneath, my fingers brushing the cool plastic of the taped phone. It was still there. I peeled it off. The tape made a tearing sound. I checked the battery. 60%. Enough. I slipped it into my pocket, along with the weight of what I had just done. Now, to clear the deck. I unfolded the cardboard box. It was a standard-issue shipping container, 12 inches by 12 inches. Corrugated brown paper smelling of pulp and glue. It was flimsy. It seemed impossible that 40 years of building an empire could fit inside a cubic foot of paper. But that was the point. The empire wasn't leaving with me, just the detonator. I placed the box on the mahogany desk. My movements were slow, deliberate. I was not a man rushing to the exit.
I was a captain stripping the bridge before scuttling the ship. To my left, the Chamber of Commerce Business Leader of the Year award caught the fluorescent light. It was a heavy crystal obelisk, sharp-edged and pretentious. I picked it up. It felt cold. I looked at the inscription, my name, etched in a sans serif font that pretended to be modern. It was a lie. The business hadn't been led by commerce, it had been led by survival. I set it back down on the desk. Let Caleb have it. He could use it as a paperweight for his termination notices. I looked at the computer monitor. The screen was dark, a black mirror reflecting a tired old man in a gray suit. The hard drive inside held emails, spreadsheets, and the official books. The forensic accountants would tear through it within the week, looking for the skeletons. They would find nothing but clean audits and perfectly balanced ledgers. The computer was a decoy. I left it plugged in. I reached for the Rolodex.
It was an archaic device in their eyes, a spinning wheel of index cards, battered and stained with coffee and grease. Caleb had offered to digitize it for me years ago. I had refused. He thought it was nostalgia. He didn't know that the cards under M weren't for maintenance, but for management, the kind that didn't have an HR department. He didn't know that the phone numbers under S were for burner phones that changed every month, the digits updated in pencil. I lifted the Rolodex. It was heavy, weighted with lead in the base so it wouldn't slide around a rocking cabin or a vibrating desk. I placed it in the box. It landed with a thud. "Is that it?" Caleb asked. I turned. He was standing by the window, holding a laser measuring tool. He aimed the red dot at the far wall, then at the desk. He was already calculating how to fit 2 standing desks into the space. He wanted an open-concept executive suite. He wanted to tear down the walls. He had no idea the walls were the only thing holding up the ceiling. "That's it," I said. Simone was leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed. She was tapping her foot again. Tap, 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 the metronome of the new regime. "You can take the photos, Dad," she said, gesturing to the framed picture of Eleanor on the credenza. "We don't need the frame." I looked at the photo. Eleanor, 20 years ago, standing in front of the very first warehouse, smiling with that fierce, quiet pride she always had. If I took it, I admitted this was a sentimental exit. If I took it, I was just a grieving widower making room for the future. "Leave it," I said. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. "It belongs to the building."
Simone frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing her face, but she shrugged it off. "Okay, we'll box it up and send it to the house later." "Do not," I said. "Throw it away." The silence in the room thickened. They stared at me. For a second, they saw something other than their father. They saw the stranger who had negotiated labor strikes with a baseball bat in the trunk of his car. But the moment passed. Caleb laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "You're being dramatic," he said. "We'll send it." I didn't argue. I picked up the box. It was light. The Rolodex, a stapler I liked, and a single brass compass Eleanor had given me. That was all. And of course, the burner phone burning a hole in my jacket pocket, unseen. I walked toward the door. The carpet, thick and navy blue, muffled my steps. I stopped at the threshold. I had to try, one last time, not for them, perhaps, but for the memory of the woman in the photograph who wouldn't have wanted her children to be collateral damage in a war they didn't start. I turned to face them. "Listen to me," I said. My voice was low, steady, lacking any tremor of age. "You are going to change a lot of things. You are going to paint the walls and fire the secretaries and buy your new trucks." "Dad, we're not firing," Caleb started. I cut him off with a raised hand. My palm was flat, hard. "I don't care. Do what you want with the day shift, but hear me. Do not change the shipping schedule for the Tuesday night route. It leaves at 11 p.m., it takes the southern bypass, it does not stop at the way station. It is vital." The air in the room seemed to freeze for a second. This was specific. This was operational. This was the exact kind of inefficiency they had spent the last 6 months railing against. Simone rolled her eyes. It was a slow, theatrical gesture, a dismissal of the past. She pulled up her tablet, tapping the screen with a manicured nail. "The Tuesday route is a black hole, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with the condescension of the educated talking to the experienced. "We've run the simulations. It's mostly empty trailers running deadhead miles to maintain presence. It's a waste of fuel. We're optimizing the routes using AI. The algorithm has already flagged that run for cancellation. We're consolidating it with the Wednesday morning distribution. The algorithm, I repeated. Does your algorithm know why the way station wave-through happens? We don't need wave-throughs, Caleb interjected, puffing out his chest. We're going to be fully compliant. No more handshake deals. We're running a modern fleet. Compliance, I said, tasting the word. It tasted like iron. You are optimizing a structural support beam because you think it spoils the view. It's just a truck, Dad, Caleb said, his patience snapping. He gestured to the door. Go home, feed the birds, let us handle the logistics.
I looked at him. I looked at the red dot of his laser measure dancing on the wall behind me. He was measuring a grave and thinking it was a swimming pool. Tuesday, I said, 11 p.m. If that truck doesn't move, the silence breaks. Goodbye, Dad, Simone said, not looking up from her screen. I nodded. I had done my duty. The ledger was balanced. I had offered the lifeline. They had used it to hang themselves. I turned and walked out. The bullpen was quiet. The open-plan office was filled with rows of cubicles, heads bowed over keyboards. I walked down the center aisle. I could feel their eyes on me, the veterans who knew, the new hires who didn't. 40 years ago, I knew the name of every man who drove for me. Now I saw faces illuminated by blue light, wearing noise-canceling headphones. They were insulated from the world. They thought the job was moving data. I pushed through the glass double doors at the front entrance. The automatic mechanism whirred, a sound like a gasp. The heat of the parking lot hit me. It was a humid, overcast day. The smell of asphalt, heated by the afternoon sun, rose up to meet me. It was a grounded smell, real, tar and stone. I walked to my car, a 5-year-old sedan, nondescript, reliable. I didn't get in immediately. I stood there, placing the box on the hood. I looked back at the building. It was a glass and steel box, reflecting the gray sky. It looked impressive. It looked strong, but I knew the foundation. I knew where the cracks were, and I knew exactly what lived in the basement. I took the burner phone out of my pocket. I checked the signal. 5 bars. I opened the car door and placed the box on the passenger seat. I sat behind the wheel. The leather was warm. I gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, feeling the texture of the material. I was unemployed. I was obsolete. I was a relic. I started the engine. It purred to life. I checked the rearview mirror. No one had followed me out. No one was waving goodbye. Tuesday, I whispered to the empty car. I put the car in gear. The tires crunched over the gravel at the edge of the lot as I pulled onto the main road. The vibration traveled up the steering column and into my arms. It felt good. It felt like control. They had their AI. They had their optimization. I had the Rolodex, the phone, and the terrifying advantage of knowing exactly when the bomb was set to go off. I drove toward the highway, merging into traffic, just another gray car and a gray stream, invisible to the algorithms that were about to tear my children's world apart. The deck was cleared. Now I just had to wait for the storm.
The silence of retirement was not empty. It was heavy. It had a texture like thick velvet curtains drawn against the midday sun. I sat on the back porch, the wooden slats beneath my rocking chair groaning in a rhythm that matched my pulse. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. In my previous life, the life that ended 72 hours ago, I would be shouting over the roar of a forklift or staring down a union steward or signing checks that kept the blood pumping through the veins of the city. Now, I watched a robin hunt for a worm in the manicured lawn. The bird was efficient. It tilted its head, listened, and struck. It did not hold meetings. It did not discuss synergy. It simply ate. I lifted the mug to my lips. The coffee was black, brewed strong enough to strip paint. It tasted of roasted earth and bitterness. It was the only sharp thing in a day that had become dangerously soft. Inside the house, the landline began to ring. It was a shrill, mechanical trill that cut through the screen door. Ring, ring, ring. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I took another sip of coffee. I knew who it was. It was the office. It was likely Simone's executive assistant, calling to ask a quick question about a password or a vendor contact or the location of a specific file key. They had been calling for 2 days. At first, the messages on the answering machine were polite. Hi, Dad. Just wondering if you recall the access code for the archive room. Yesterday, they became strained. Dad, pick up. The automated system is flagging an error on the routing manifest. Today, if I answered, I would hear the first tremors of panic.
I let it ring until the answering machine clicked on. I heard Caleb's voice, tinny and distorted by the recording. Dad, are you there? Look, we have a situation with a vendor, Orion Logistics. They're claiming we missed a pickup. I can't find their contract in the digital database. Call me back, immediately. The machine beeped. The silence rushed back in to fill the void. Orion Logistics. I looked at the steam rising from my cup. Caleb wouldn't find Orion in the digital database. Orion didn't exist in the cloud. Orion existed in a handshake I made in a diner in 1998, and in the physical ledger currently sitting in the bottom of a landfill or wherever the shredding service took the contents of my trash. I checked my watch. It was an analog Timex, reliable as gravity. It had been 3 days since the Tuesday route was canceled. The optimization had taken effect. In my mind, I saw the map. I saw the truck that should have left the warehouse at 11 p.m. heading south toward the state line. It was a ghost truck now.
The way the system worked was simple, beautiful, and deadly. The Syndicate, my silent partners, didn't just hand us cash. That was amateur. They used us to launder the movement of goods. We shipped high-priority auto parts, empty crates with lead weights, to a shell company in the next state. They paid us a premium shipping fee. That fee was the clean money that padded our margins, that paid for the new fleet, that put Caleb and Simone through Ivy League schools. But the billing cycle was a 3-week delay. Week 1, the shipment is missed. The receiving end, a warehouse in New Jersey run by men with no necks, notes the absence. They assume a breakdown. They wait. Week 2, the invoice for the shipment is generated automatically by our system, or it was until Caleb's AI likely flagged it as an anomaly and deleted it. The Syndicate sees no truck and no invoice. They get annoyed. They make a phone call to the emergency line. That line was the burner phone currently taped under the dashboard of my car. Week 3, the payment stops, the clean money dries up, and then the questions begin. Not the polite questions from an auditor, but the questions from men who visit your house at 3 a.m. with baseball bats. We were in the middle of week 1. Caleb was confused. By next Tuesday, he would be scared. By the 3rd Tuesday, he would be in danger. I set the coffee mug down on the railing. I needed to verify the lifeboat. I walked into the house, ignoring the blinking red light on the answering machine. It pulsed like a slow heartbeat. One message, one warning. I went to the library. A small room smelled of old paper and lemon oil. I pulled the copy of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire from the shelf. It was a cliché, I knew, but effective. I opened the hollowed-out center. My passport was there. I took it out, feeling the texture of the cover. It was valid for another 4 years. I opened it to the photo. I looked younger then, less gray, but the eyes were the same, wary. Calculating. Next to it was a bank book for an account in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't a fortune, I wasn't a thief, but it was enough. Enough to disappear. Enough to live out my days in a small apartment in Lisbon or Santiago if the fire spread too close to this house. And finally, the deed to the warehouse on 4th Street, the one I had forced them to keep. The one asset that, if played correctly, could be the bargaining chip that saved their lives when the partners came to collect the debt. I ran my thumb over the seal on the deed. This piece of paper was the only shield I had left to give them, but I couldn't give it to them yet. They had to be desperate enough to take it without asking questions. They had to be terrified enough to listen. I put everything back in the book and slid it onto the shelf. I walked to the kitchen window. I washed my hands in the sink, the water hot and scalding. I scrubbed them as if I could wash off the ink from the signature I had placed on the indemnification clause. You're tired, Dad. Let us handle the burden. I shut off the water. The pipes shuddered. I wasn't tired. I was awake. I was more awake than I had been in 20 years. I walked back out to the porch. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the lawn. A squirrel chattered from the oak tree, a sound of alarm. I sat back down. I picked up the cold coffee. I was a spectator in the Colosseum. I was sitting in the high seats, watching the gladiators enter the arena below. They were my children. They were wearing shining armor made of arrogance and degrees. They were waving to the crowd, smiling, checking their stock options. They didn't see the gate at the other end of the arena opening.
They didn't see the darkness inside. They didn't hear the low guttural growl of the lions stepping out into the light. The lions were hungry. They hadn't been fed their Tuesday meal. I took a sip of the cold sludge. It was bitter, but I swallowed it. Let the phone ring. Let the confusion set in. The lesson had to be learned, and unfortunately, pain was the only teacher that never lied. I checked the timeline in my head again. 18 days left until the lions reached the center of the arena. I closed my eyes and listened to the birds, waiting for the first scream.
The industrial district at night usually smelled of diesel, wet cardboard, and the faint, sweet rot of the river. It was a smell I had breathed for 40 years. It was the smell of money, of work, of things moving in the dark so the world could look bright in the morning. But tonight, as I turned the corner onto Terminal Avenue, the air smelled of latex and solvents. I slowed the sedan, letting the engine idle low. I rolled down the window, letting the humid night air invade the climate-controlled cabin. There it was, my life's work, or what was left of it. They had painted the warehouse. For 3 decades, the building had been a stoic, invisible gray, cinder block and corrugated steel that dissolved into the fog and the soot of the city. It was designed not to be seen. It was camouflage. Now, under the harsh glare of the sodium street lamps, it screamed. They had painted it a vibrant, aggressive shade of royal blue. Synergy blue, Caleb probably called it. A massive white logo, a stylized arrow pointing upward, was emblazoned on the side, illuminated by solar-powered floodlights. It looked like a tech startup. It looked like a juice bar for trucks. It looked like a target. I pulled into the shadows of an abandoned lot across the street, killing the headlights. I sat there, invisible, just another piece of debris in the gutters of commerce. I watched the main gate. In my time, the gate was manned by Sal. Old Sal. He was a man made of gristle and bad decisions, with a cigar permanently fused to his lip. Sal was on the payroll for 30 years, not because he was a good security guard, but because he was a good filter. Sal knew every driver by the sound of their air brakes. He knew that when the dark green rig with the mud-splattered plates rolled up at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, he didn't log the entry. He didn't ask for the manifest. He opened the gate, tipped his cap, and looked the other way. Sal was the firewall. He was the human gap in the record that kept us safe. But Sal was gone. Redundant, the memo had likely said. In his place stood a sleek silver pillar. A high-definition camera with a red LED eye sat atop it, swiveling with robotic precision. A keypad and a QR code scanner waited for drivers who were now expected to be digitally verified. The cloud-based access control system. Caleb had bragged about it in the company newsletter I still received but didn't read. Total transparency, real-time tracking. I watched a truck pull up. It was a legitimate delivery. Paper products, probably. The driver leaned out, scanned a code on his phone. The gate beeped, a cheerful, high-pitched chirp, and slid open. The camera flashed, capturing the license plate, the driver's face, the time, the date. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They had blinded themselves by opening their eyes too wide. That camera didn't know the difference between a shipment of napkins and a shipment of unlisted inventory. It would record everything. It would create a permanent time-stamped, geotagged digital footprint of every single felony committed on the property. If the Tuesday truck showed up and the drivers were creatures of habit, they might try one last time before the syndicate pulled the plug. The camera would log it. It would log the unauthorized entry. It would log the lack of a manifest. And when the forensic accountants or the FBI subpoenaed the cloud, they wouldn't find a gap. They would find a confession. "You fools," I whispered. My voice sounded loud in the quiet car. "You built a prison and locked yourselves inside." I was about to put the car in gear, to leave before the tragedy of it made me sick, when I saw the shadow. It was 50 yards down the road, parked facing the warehouse entrance. A black sedan, American make, 4 doors, heavy suspension. A Crown Victoria. It was distinct. Even in the dark, the silhouette of government authority is unmistakable to a man who has spent a lifetime dodging it. It sat motionless, lights off, engine likely running to power the AC in the surveillance gear. I picked up the pair of binoculars I kept in the glove box.
old Nikon field glasses, heavy and scratched. I brought them to my eyes. The windows of the Crown Vic were tinted, but the streetlight caught the reflection of a laptop screen on the passenger side, a faint blue glow illuminating a stern face. My heart didn't race. It slowed down. This was the chess player's mindset kicking in, the cold calculation of threat assessment. That wasn't the Syndicate. The Syndicate drove SUVs or luxury sedans, and they didn't need to watch the gate. They owned the inventory. This was the law. This was federal. They were watching the warehouse. Why? The timeline shifted in my head. I had assumed we were in the confusion phase, but if the feds were already sitting on the location, it meant they had been watching before I left. It meant they had sensed the weakness, or perhaps they had picked up chatter on the wire. The sharks. I lowered the binoculars. Caleb and Simone were inside their glass boardroom, high-fiving over efficiency metrics and the money they saved by firing Sal. They were worried about Orion Logistics and a missing payment. They didn't realize that the man in the Crown Vic was logging every truck that entered and exited. They didn't realize that the rebranding had just put a spotlight on a crime scene. The blue paint on the warehouse didn't look cheerful anymore. It looked like the dye pack exploding in a bank robber's bag. The realization hit me with the weight of a sledgehammer. The feds weren't raiding yet. Why? Because they were waiting for something specific. They were waiting for the pattern to confirm the crime. They were waiting for the Tuesday truck. They wanted the RICO predicate. If that truck showed up next Tuesday, and the camera logged it, and the feds saw it, it wasn't just a business failure. It was 20 years to life. I watched the Crown Vic for another minute. The occupant didn't move. He was patient. He was paid to be patient. My children were swimming in deep water, bleeding from a dozen self-inflicted cuts, and the dorsal fin had just broken the surface. I put the binoculars away. I put the car in drive. I didn't turn on my headlights until I was 2 blocks away. I drove home in silence. The city moved past me, a blur of lights and noise. The game had changed. It wasn't just about protecting them from the Syndicate anymore. It was a race. I had to ensure the Syndicate realized the game was over before the feds got the evidence they needed to drop the hammer. I needed the Tuesday truck to stop, permanently. But I couldn't call Caleb. His phone was likely already tapped. If I warned him, I became a co-conspirator in the cover-up. The indemnification clause protected me from the past, not from active obstruction of justice in the present. I had to be smarter. I had to cut the supply line from the source. I turned onto my quiet suburban street. The houses were dark, asleep. My driveway was empty. I parked the car. The engine ticked as it cooled. I needed to make a call, but not from here, and not to Caleb. I needed to call the number on the back of the card in the Rolodex under V. Victor, the dispatcher for the trucking company that didn't technically exist. I had to tell the wolves that the sheep were poisoned. It was the only way to keep them from eating. I stepped out of the car. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. The first drop of rain hit the pavement, dark and heavy. A storm was coming. I walked up the path to my front door, the keys heavy in my hand. Inside, the red light on the answering machine was still blinking, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next time the phone rang, it wouldn't be Caleb asking for a password. It would be the sound of the trap snapping shut. The rain had started an hour ago. It wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a cold, insistent drizzle that slicked the windows and turned the world outside into a blurred watercolor of grays and browns. I sat at the kitchen table, the wood grain cool under my elbows. In front of me sat a cup of Earl Grey. It was steeping, the dark liquid swirling with the bergamot oil, smelling of citrus and old libraries. I watched the steam rise, twisting into shapes that vanished as soon as they formed. The phone rang. It wasn't the polite chirping of a cell phone. It was the landline, the heavy mechanical trill that demanded attention. It echoed off the tile floor. Ring, ring. I didn't reach for it immediately. I took a sip of the tea. It was hot, scalding the roof of my mouth. Good. It reminded me I was still here, still solid. I picked up the receiver on the 4th ring. Thorne residence, I said. My voice was level, a flat line of static. Dad? It was Caleb. But it wasn't the Caleb who had stood in the boardroom 3 days ago, puffed up with the helium of his own importance. This voice was tight, compressed. It was pitched an octave higher than his natural register, the voice of a boy who has just realized the vase he broke was the expensive one. "Hello, Caleb," I said. "It's late. It's 7 o'clock, Dad. Listen, I need you to clarify something. I could hear the background noise on his end, the hum of the server room, the clatter of keyboards. He was still at the office, working late to optimize the disaster he had created. I am retired, Caleb. Clarification is a consultant's job. Stop it. Just stop with the Yoda act for a second, he snapped, fear making him aggressive. We have a discrepancy in accounts receivable, a major one. The system flagged a recurring outbound shipment to a holding company called Orion Group. Orion. The name hung in the air between us, heavy and ancient. To Caleb, it was a data point. To me, it was a constellation of dangerous men who didn't believe in invoices. And, I asked, blowing gently on my tea, and they weren't in the CRM, said Caleb, his words tumbling out fast. No tax ID, no digital contract, no verified address, just a routing number and a P.O. box in Jersey. So the system auto-purged them. We cut them off, flagged the Tuesday shipment as invalid vendor, and canceled the dispatch. I closed my eyes. I could see it happening. The algorithm, cold and efficient, seeing the anomaly and excising it like a tumor. But it wasn't a tumor. It was the pacemaker. You canceled the Tuesday dispatch? I repeated. Yes, of course I did. It was non-compliant, Caleb said. But now, Dad, now there's a problem. The truck is sitting in the yard, but I just got a call, not an email, a call to the main switchboard. Who was it? They didn't say. A man. He just said, the inventory is stagnant, and then he hung up. And now, I'm looking at the accounts and I can't find where the payments for the last 10 years came from. It looks like money laundering, Dad. It looks like a slush fund. He was close. He was standing on the edge of the cliff, looking down into the fog, and he was starting to make out the shapes of the rocks below. The inventory is stagnant, I said. It was code. It meant, move the product or we move on you. What is Orion, Dad? Why isn't there a contract?
I took another sip of tea. The tannins were bitter on my tongue. I told you, Caleb, in the office, the Tuesday night route, I told you it was vital. You said it was important. You didn't say it was whatever this is. You didn't say it was off the books. It isn't off the books, I said calmly. It is in the red ledger, the physical one, the one I told you to read before you installed your cameras. The handbook? Caleb scoffed, hysterical now. That dust-covered binder in the safe? I thought that was just your old union notes. I didn't read it. Then you have failed your first audit, I said. Dad, you need to come in, he demanded. Right now, you need to come down here and explain this to me. You need to authorize the release of this truck if it's so important. The driver refuses to move it without a Code 4 clearance, and I don't know what the hell that is. Come in, walk into the trap. Walk past the blue paint and the cameras. Walk past the Crown Vic parked across the street that was recording every panic-stricken face in the window. If I went in, I violated the indemnification. If I went in, I showed the feds that I was still pulling the strings. If I went in, I became the captain of the Titanic again, just as it hit the iceberg.
I cannot come in, Caleb, I said. I am legally retired. The transition agreement, Section 8, Paragraph C, is quite specific. You have full operational control. Dad, don't quote legalese at me. This is serious. It is, I agreed. It is very serious. That is why I advised you not to change the schedule. I'll subpoena you, he shouted. It was a hollow threat, the lashing out of a drowning man. I'll drag you back in here. You have the authority to manage the fleet, Caleb. You wanted the wheel. You have it. What do I do? He whispered. The anger was gone, replaced by raw terror. The guy on the phone, he sounded dead. Just dead inside. What do I do? I looked at the rain streaking the window. It looked like bars on a cell. Read the handbook, Caleb, I said, if you haven't shredded it yet. Dad! Goodbye, son. I pulled the receiver away from my ear. I could still hear his voice, tiny and tinny, shouting my name. Dad! Elijah! Wait! I placed the handset back on the cradle. The click was final. It was the sound of a lock engaging. The silence rushed back into the kitchen. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. The air felt thinner, electrically charged.
The first domino had fallen. Caleb had cut the line. The signal had been sent to the Syndicate, "We are closed for business." And the signal had been sent to the feds watching from the street, "The pattern is broken. Panic is setting in." I looked at my hands. They were steady. I felt a profound, aching sadness deep in the marrow of my bones. I had just listened to my son realize that he wasn't a businessman, but a prey animal. I finished my tea. I rinsed the cup in the sink, drying it carefully with a towel. I placed it back in the cupboard. I walked to the living room and sat in the armchair facing the window. I didn't turn on the lamp. I sat in the dark, watching the rain, waiting for the inevitable escalation. Caleb wouldn't read the handbook. He was too arrogant to believe the answer was on paper. He would try to fix it with an email or a wire transfer or a lawyer. He would make it worse. And I would sit here in the fortress he had paid for and wait for the moment when I could step in, not to save the company, but to save the bodies. The game had officially begun.
The grocery store was a palace of false abundance. Pyramids of waxed apples, misted lettuce, and shelves stocked with 20 varieties of bread that all tasted like sawdust. It was 10 a.m. on a Thursday. This was the hour of retirees and young mothers. The air conditioning was set too low, humming with a vibration that settled in the teeth. I was in the produce section, inspecting hothouse tomatoes. They were too red, too perfect, and likely hard as baseballs. I squeezed one gently, no give. "The navel's a good this year," a voice said. "Thick skin, hard to bruise." I didn't turn immediately. I knew the voice. It was soft, dry, like leaves skittering across pavement. It belonged to a man who had sat in the back of my warehouse 3 times in 20 years, always in the shadows, always leaving an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. I placed the tomato back on the pile. I turned slowly. Mr. Gray stood by the citrus bin. He looked indistinguishable from the other pensioners. He wore a beige windbreaker, pressed slacks, and corrective shoes. He held a mesh bag of oranges in one hand, weighing them. He looked like a grandfather who carried butterscotch candies in his pocket. But I looked at his eyes. They were gray, flat, and completely devoid of the spark that separates the living from the things that end life.
"Mr. Gray," I said. My pulse remained steady. I checked the perimeter in the reflection of the display case. No backup, just him. This wasn't a hit, it was a courtesy call. "Mr. Thorne," he nodded, a small, respectful dip of the chin. "I heard you had transitioned to a life of leisure." "I am retired," I said, "legally and physically." "Yes," Gray said. He picked up an orange, turning it over in his hand. His fingers were long, manicured, clean. "We saw the paperwork. The indemnification, very thorough. Your legal counsel is to be commended." He knew about the clause. Of course he did. He probably had a copy before the ink was dry. "It was time," I said. Gray sighed. It was a sound of genuine disappointment. "Time is a resource, Elijah. Management has changed. We appreciate change. We adapt to change." He paused, his thumb digging slightly into the rind of the orange. "But the new management is inefficient." The word hung in the chilled air between us. In Mr. Gray's vocabulary, inefficient was a synonym for terminal. "They are young," I said, offering a defense I knew was flimsy. "They are learning the systems." "They are not learning," Gray corrected gently. "They are dismantling. The Tuesday inventory is piling up. It sits on the dock. It attracts flies. It attracts eyes." He meant the feds. He knew about the Crown Vic. He knew about the cameras. "I have no control over operations," I said. I had to hold the line. If I showed weakness, if I showed I could influence them, he would demand I fix it, and I couldn't fix it without going to prison. "I am out of the game, Mr. Gray. I grow tomatoes now." I gestured to the red pile behind me. Mr. Gray looked at the tomatoes, then back at me. A smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. It was a cold shifting of facial muscles, a mechanical approximation of human emotion. "Tomatoes are safe," he said softly. "Inefficiency is not." He dropped the bag of oranges into his basket. The thud was soft, heavy. "The billing cycle ends on Friday," he added, almost as an afterthought.
Nature abhors a vacuum, Elijah, and we abhor a deficit. I understand, I said. I know you do. That is why we always liked you. You understood the value of silence. He buttoned his windbreaker. Give my regards to the children, while you can. He turned and walked away. He moved with a fluid, predator grace that the corrective shoes couldn't mask. I watched him merge into the aisle of cereal boxes, disappearing between the Lucky Charms and the Fiber Flakes. I stood alone in the cold aisle. He wasn't coming for me. That was the message. I had honored the code. I had left the game clean. But the clock he had just set was loud enough to deafen me. Friday. Today was Thursday. The clean money stopped tomorrow. The syndicate wasn't just annoyed, they were preparing to cut the loss. And in their world, you didn't fire an incompetent partner. You erased them.
I looked down at the tomato in my hand. I hadn't realized I'd picked it up again. My thumb had pressed into the skin, bruising it, splitting the flesh. Juice ran down my thumb, red and sticky. I wiped my hand on my handkerchief. I left the cart where it was. I didn't need groceries. I needed to go home and wait for the inevitable collision. The intermediary had spoken. The grace period was over. Mr. Gray had just signed my children's death warrants in the fruit aisle, and he hadn't even raised his voice. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside my kitchen window looking scrubbed and raw. It was Friday evening. The deadline Mr. Gray had whispered in the produce aisle had come and gone. The silence in the house was absolute, until the front door flew open without a knock. Simone stood in the hallway. She had a key, for emergencies, she used to say. This was evidently an emergency. She looked like a building that had been condemned but not yet demolished. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe, glossy chignon, was loose and fraying at the edges. Her blouse was wrinkled. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, looking like bruises on a piece of fruit left out too long. She didn't say hello. She walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking aggressively on the linoleum, and threw a stack of papers onto the table. They landed with a heavy, accusatory slap. "Explain it," she said. Her voice was brittle, like dry twigs snapping. I remained seated. I was finishing a crossword puzzle. 12 down. A burden or impediment. 5 letters. Onus. "Hello, Simone," I said, capping my pen. "You look tired. Sit down. I'll make tea." "I don't want tea," she shouted, the veneer of the corporate executive cracking completely. She slammed her hand down on the papers. "I want to know where the money came from, Dad, because I've spent the last 48 hours with the forensic audit team, and the math doesn't work." I looked at the spreadsheet. It was a printout of the last fiscal year, covered in red ink marks. It was an autopsy report of a company that had died 3 days ago. "The math always worked when I was in the chair," I said calmly. "That's just it." She pulled a chair out and collapsed into it, not with grace, but with exhaustion. She ran a hand through her hair. "For 20 years, our operating costs have exceeded our legitimate revenue by nearly 40%. Fuel, maintenance, insurance. We should have been bankrupt in 2005, but we weren't, because of miscellaneous logistics fees, because of Orion Group, because of these ghosts." She pointed a trembling finger at a column highlighted in yellow. "We cut them off," she whispered, her eyes wide, staring at the numbers as if they were a monster. "We cut off Orion because they didn't meet the compliance standards. And the moment we did, the cash flow didn't just dip, it evaporated. We can't make payroll next week, Dad. We can't buy fuel." She looked up at me, and for the first time I saw the little girl who used to ask me to check under her bed for monsters. She had found the monster, but it wasn't under the bed. It was in the bank account. "What did we do?" she asked. "What was Orion?" I looked at her. I saw the intelligence in her eyes warring with the denial. She knew. She just wanted me to say it so she didn't have to. "You wanted modernization," I said, my voice low and steady. "You looked at the company and saw fat. You saw inefficiency. You saw a truck running empty at night, and you saw waste." "It was waste," she insisted, but the conviction was gone. "No," I said. "It was the price of admission." I stood up and walked to the counter. I didn't look at her. "You saw the body of the business, Simone. You saw the muscles and the skin, and you decided to perform surgery to make it leaner, to make it prettier." I turned back to face her. "But you didn't know anatomy. You thought you were cutting the fat, but you cut the artery." Simone went pale. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked like she might faint. She looked down at the spreadsheet again. The numbers weren't just losses anymore. They were evidence. "It was dirty," she whispered. "All of it? The house? The tuition? My car?" "It was laundered," I corrected. "There is a difference. The dirt was washed off before it touched you. That was my job. I was the washerman." "Oh my God," she breathed. She put her hand over her mouth. "And we just stopped the machine." "You unplugged it," I said, "and the people who own the clothes are waiting for their laundry." She stared at me with a mix of horror and betrayal. "You let us do it. You let us sign the papers. You let us take the fall." "I told you," I said, my voice hardening. "I told you not to touch the Tuesday route. I told you it was vital. You rolled your eyes. You called it a black hole." "I didn't know," she screamed, tears finally spilling over. "I didn't know it was the mob."
Ignorance was your luxury, Simone. I paid for that luxury every day for 40 years. Now the bill has come due and you are the one holding the wallet. She stood up, backing away from the table as if the spreadsheet were radioactive. I have to call the police. We have to tell them." "Sit down," I commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the voice I used to stop a warehouse brawl. She froze. "If you call the police," I said, "you admit to RICO conspiracy. You admit to managing a company funded by organized crime. You signed the indemnification, Simone. You and Caleb. You took all liability, past, present, and future. If you go to the cops, you go to prison. If you don't—" "If I don't?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Then you deal with the creditors," I said, "and they don't file liens." She sank back into the chair, buried her face in her hands and sobbed. It was a wretched, broken sound. I watched her. I felt a pang in my chest, a sharp ache of paternal instinct urging me to go to her, to hug her, to tell her I would fix it. I wanted to pull her back from the abyss, but I stayed where I was. She had to feel the terror. She had to understand the stakes, because in about 24 hours, she and Caleb would be the only bait I had to trap the real predators. If I saved her now, she would run to the feds, and we would all die. "Dry your eyes," I said, handing her a napkin. "Tears are inefficient." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. She hated me in that moment. I could see it. She hated me for the crime, and she hated me for the trap. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice hollow. "You go home," I said. "You wait. You do not call the police. You do not call Orion. You let the system fail." "And then?" "And then," I said, looking out the window at the darkness gathering on the lawn, "I will see if I can salvage the wreckage." She stood up, taking the spreadsheet. She crumpled it in her hand. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back. She looked like a stranger. "I wish you had just sold the company," she said. "I tried," I lied. "But nobody buys a haunted house." She left. The door clicked shut. I was alone again. The house was quiet, but the air was vibrating. The books didn't balance. The deficit was real. And now the creditors were coming to collect. I went to the phone. I didn't call Caleb. I didn't call the police. I dialed a number that wasn't in the book, a number that would ring in a basement in New Jersey. It was time to escalate the timeline. I needed the wolves to come to the door while the feds were watching. I needed a collision. I held the receiver to my ear and waited for the click. The vibration of the phone against the oak table was a short, violent buzz. It sounded like a trapped wasp. I didn't pick it up immediately. I was cleaning my reading glasses with a microfiber cloth, watching the dust motes drift in the afternoon sun. It was Monday, December 22nd, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. The darkness would come early today. I glanced at the screen. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from the encrypted banking app I had forced Caleb to install, mirrored to my device. Alert: assets frozen, pursuant to DOJ Order 884-C. The letters were small, white against a red background. They were the digital equivalent of a door slamming shut. The FBI had finished their audit. They had traced the missing Orion payments, saw the hole in the books, and decided to stop the bleeding. They had seized the accounts. Payroll, operating capital, the slush fund, all of it was now ice. The corporate heart had stopped beating. 2 seconds later, the phone rang.
It was Caleb. The ringtone was the default marimba, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the quiet house. I slid the icon to answer. Dad. One word. It wasn't spoken, it was exhaled. It was wet, ragged, and trembling. It was the sound of a man who has just realized he is standing on a trapdoor that has already opened.
I saw the alert, Caleb, I said. My voice was calm, the voice of a pilot announcing turbulence while the engines are on fire. The assets are frozen. The feds had made their move. No, it's not the accounts, Caleb wept. He was whispering, huddled somewhere close to the receiver. I could hear the background noise, the hum of the servers, the frantic, hushed silence of an office that knows something is wrong. Dad, they're here. Who is here? The FBI? No, it's not the police. Them. The men you talked about. The silent partners. I closed my eyes. I pictured the lobby of the office, glass walls, modern art, the receptionist's desk made of reclaimed wood. Describe them, I commanded. How many? 2, maybe 3. They're in the waiting room. They didn't sign in. The receptionist asked them to leave, and they sat down. Dad, they're staring at the glass doors. They're just staring at me. What do they look like? Regular. Windbreakers. Jeans. One has a duffel bag. Dad, they look like plumbers, but their eyes, they look dead.
The collection crew. They weren't the suits like Mr. Gray. These were the mechanics. They were here to dismantle the engine because it wouldn't start. The duffel bag wasn't for tools. It was for the money, or for the pieces of my son they intended to take as collateral. They sent a message in with the receptionist, Caleb whispered. They said they're here for the outstanding balance. They said the billing cycle is closed. Listen to me very carefully, I said, leaning forward, my elbows resting on the table. Where is Simone? She's in her office. She's throwing up in the trash can. She can't stop shaking. And the doors? Locked, maglocks. But, Dad, one of them is tapping on the glass with a coin. Just tapping. Click, click, click. I could feel the rhythm of it in my own teeth. It was psychological warfare. They were waiting for the panic to open the door. You are in a double bind, Caleb, I said, my voice hard as granite. You need to understand your position. Help me. Call the police. Call your friends. If you call the police, I said, cutting through his hysteria, you are arrested immediately. The asset freeze is the precursor to a RICO indictment. If the police come, they will find the unauthorized routing, the missing inventory, and the Orion discrepancy. You will go to federal prison for 20 years. I don't care. I'd rather go to prison.
But, I continued, ignoring him, if you open that door, those men will not arrest you. They will take you. They will take you to a second location to discuss the outstanding balance. And since the accounts are frozen, you cannot pay them. You have no currency but your own skin. Oh God, Caleb moaned. Oh God, oh God. You are trapped between a cage and a coffin, son. The government wants you for the crime. The Syndicate wants you for the theft. What do I do? He shrieked. It was a raw, primal sound. Dad, please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I changed the route. I'm sorry I mocked the ledger. Just save me. I looked at the clock on the wall. 4:15 p.m. The sun was setting. The shadows in my kitchen were stretching out, long and thin like fingers. The FBI was watching the money. They were likely monitoring the phones, too, but they weren't inside the building yet. They were waiting for the warrant, or waiting for the suspects to run. They didn't know about the men in the lobby. I had to force the collision. I had to make the two jaws of the trap snap together, catching each other instead of my children.
Caleb, I said, do not open the door. Do not call 911. Then what? Go to the window, I said, the one facing the parking lot. Can you see the street?
Yes, I can see it. Is there a black Crown Victoria parked near the hydrant? Yes, it's been there all week. I thought it was a creeping commuter. It is not a commuter. That is the FBI surveillance team. Caleb went silent. The reality of the siege was settling in. He was surrounded. They are watching you, I said. They are waiting for you to make a mistake. And the men in the lobby are waiting for the sun to go down. Dad, the man stopped tapping. He's standing up. He's putting on gloves, leather gloves. My stomach tightened. The timeline had accelerated. They weren't going to wait. They knew the accounts were frozen too. The Syndicate had sources in the banks. They knew the money was gone. Now it was just a cleanup operation. No witnesses. Listen to me, I said. You have exactly 5 minutes before they breach that glass. Those maglocks are strong, but a fire extinguisher through the pane will shatter it. I'm going to die, Caleb said. He sounded small. He sounded like the boy who used to hide behind my leg when a dog barked. No, I said, you are not going to die, but you are going to lose everything else. I don't care about the company. I don't care about the money. Good, because that is the price. I stood up. I grabbed my car keys from the hook. Trigger the silent alarm, I said. What? You said not to call the police. Not the police alarm, you idiot, I snapped. The fire alarm, the manual pull station by the door. Fire? The fire department responds in 4 minutes. The police respond in 10. But when the fire alarm goes off, the maglocks on the doors disengage automatically for safety. And the noise creates chaos. If the doors open, they'll come in. If the doors open, the strobe lights flash and the siren wails, I said, walking to the door. The men in the lobby rely on silence. They rely on discretion. They are cockroaches, Caleb. They hate the light. And the FBI? The FBI will see the alarm. They will see the strobe lights from the street. They will assume you are destroying evidence. They will breach the building. You want me to let the FBI in? I want you to let the FBI meet the Syndicate. I want you to put the wolves in the same room as the bear.
Dad! Pull the lever, Caleb, I commanded. Pull it and get Simone under the desk. Do not come out until you see badges, real badges. Where will you be? I will be watching, I said. Dad, I love you, he stammered. Pull the lever. I hung up. I walked out to the car. The air was cold, biting. I could smell the coming snow. I didn't drive toward the office entrance. I drove toward the hill that overlooked the industrial park, the high ground. I had just authorized the destruction of my life's work. The fire alarm would bring the trucks, the police, the news crews. The collision between the hit squad and the federal agents would be violent and public. The company would be a crime scene. The assets would be seized. My children would be arrested, but they would be alive. I started the engine. The dashboard glowed, a constellation of lights in the gathering dark. The double bind was broken. I had chosen the cage over the coffin. Now I had to watch them close the door. The hill was nothing more than a mound of compacted earth and scrub grass, a geological afterthought overlooking the industrial park. We used to call it the Overlook, back when the drivers would sneak up here to smoke illegal cigarettes or sleep off a hangover before a shift. It was the only place in the valley where you could see the roof of every warehouse for 3 miles. I parked the sedan in the shadow of an old water tower. I killed the engine. The silence of the car was immediate, but the world outside was already beginning to scream. I rolled down the window just an inch. The air was frigid, tasting of impending snow and burnt diesel. I could hear them in the distance, the sirens. A rising, wailing chorus converging from the north and the east. Police, fire, federal. I picked up the binoculars. They were cold against my eye sockets, the metal rim biting into the skin. I adjusted the focus wheel. The lenses were scratched, but the glass was good. Down below, half a mile away, my life's work was strobing like a disco in hell. The alarm well was doing its job. The white strobe lights mounted on the exterior of the building were flashing in a frantic, epileptic rhythm. Flash, dark, flash, dark. It turned the parking lot into a stuttering film reel. I saw the Crown Victoria first. It had abandoned its subtle perch by the hydrant. It was now diagonally across the main entrance, doors open, blue lights spinning on the dash. The 2 agents were out, weapons drawn, crouching behind the engine block. They weren't waiting for a warrant anymore. The alarm gave them probable cause, exigent circumstances.
Then the raid vans arrived, black, unmarked, terrifyingly efficient. They didn't use sirens, they just swarmed the curb like beetles. I shifted my gaze to the loading dock, the back entrance, the throat of the beast. This was where the silent partners would try to exit. It was the way they always came in, and it was the way they would try to leave. They were creatures of habit, and they assumed the police would focus on the front lobby. They were wrong. I watched through the lenses as the back door flew open. It kicked outward with violence. 2 men spilled out onto the concrete loading ramp. Even at this distance, I recognized the posture. Hunched, frantic, carrying the duffel bag. The plumbers. They took 2 steps before the floodlights hit them. Blinding white beams cut through the gloom from the perimeter fence. SWAT. They had breached the rear gate while the fire alarm created chaos at the front. I saw the men freeze. It was a tableau of total defeat. One of them dropped the bag. The other raised his hands, slowly, as if the air around him had suddenly turned to molasses. They were forced to the ground. I saw the boots on their backs. I saw the zip ties. The collision had happened. The federal government had just arrested the Syndicate's collection agents on the property of a legitimate business. The link was forged. The Orion discrepancy wasn't just accounting fraud anymore. It was an active crime scene involving armed combatants.
I lowered the binoculars for a moment, rubbing my eyes. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Thump, thump. I had done it. I had saved their lives. The Syndicate couldn't touch them now. They were federal property. They were evidence. I raised the glasses again. I had to see the rest. I had to witness the cost of the ransom. The front doors of the office building, the beautiful glass doors Caleb was so proud of, were open. A stream of employees was filing out, hands on their heads, looking confused and terrified in the strobe light glare. The coders, the HR reps, the kids who thought they were working for a tech company. And then the main event. 2 agents led them out. Caleb came first. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was untucked, billowing in the wind. His hands were cuffed behind his back. He was walking with a strange, stumbling gait, as if he had forgotten how his legs worked. His head was down, chin to his chest. He looked small. He looked like he had shrunk inside his clothes. The expensive Italian wool trousers pooled around his ankles. Simone was behind him. She was walking upright, trying to maintain some shred of dignity, but I could see the shake in her shoulders. She wasn't wearing her coat. The wind must have been cutting through her silk blouse like a knife. They stopped them by the lead van. An agent was reading them their rights. I knew the script. You have the right to remain silent.
It was the one right they had never exercised. I zoomed in. The image was grainy, shaking slightly with the tremor of my own hands. I saw Caleb lift his head. He was scanning the perimeter. He looked at the street. He looked at the news vans that were just starting to arrive, their satellite dishes extending like masts. He looked at the crowd of onlookers gathering behind the police tape. He was looking for me. I could feel it. He was looking for the man who always fixed it, the man who knew the judges, the union reps, the cops. He was looking for the father who would step out of the shadows, shake a hand, make a call, and make the bad men go away. He looked up at the hill. For a second, the binoculars felt like a telescope connecting our souls. He stared right at the water tower. He couldn't see me. I was a shadow in a shadow, inside a dark car. But he knew. He knew I was watching. I saw his mouth move. Dad.
Then the agent put a hand on his head and pushed him into the back of the van. The door slammed shut. Simone followed. She didn't look around. She just stepped up into the cage, her face a mask of porcelain shock. The van doors locked. I lowered the binoculars to my lap. The scene below continued. The flashing lights, the news crews setting up their shots, the yellow tape being unspooled. But the play was over. The actors had left the stage. I sat there for a long time. The cold seeped into the car, numbing my fingers. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a witness. My children were safe. They would go to federal prison, likely for a few years, maybe less if they cooperated. They would lose the company. They would lose the house, the cars, the reputation. They would be bankrupt and branded. But they wouldn't be found in a ditch in the Pine Barrens. They wouldn't be liquidated for an outstanding balance. I had traded their freedom for their survival. It was the hardest bargain I had ever struck. I reached for the ignition. My hand hesitated over the key. The FBI would have questions. They would trace the company history. They would find the clean audits, the perfect paperwork, the indemnification clause signed 3 days ago. They would find a retired old man who grew tomatoes and had been pushed out by ambitious children who wanted to modernize. But they would try. They would come for me. They would try to find the crack in the armor. I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. I didn't look back at the industrial park. I didn't look at the blue building that was now a crime scene. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the shadow of the water tower, and turned the wheel toward the main road. I had one more performance to give. The grieving father, the shocked retiree, the man who knew nothing. I drove slowly, keeping to the speed limit. The snow began to fall, fat white flakes drifting down through the headlight beams, covering the tracks I had left in the mud. By morning, the hill would be white and pristine, as if no one had ever been there at all. The doorbell rang at noon. It was a polite, insistent ring, not the frantic buzzing of the press who had been camped at the bottom of the driveway for 2 days. I wiped my hands on the dish towel. I had been slicing lemons. I walked to the door. I didn't rush. I checked the peephole. He was young. He wore a suit that was off the rack, polyester blend, cut too tight in the chest. He had a badge clipped to his belt and a hunger in his eyes that I recognized. It was the look of a man who thinks he has cornered a fox, not realizing he has walked into a bear den. I opened the door. The winter air rushed in, smelling of snow and exhaust. "Mr. Thorne?" "I am," I said. I kept the screen door latched. "Special Agent Miller, FBI, Financial Crimes Division." He held up his credentials. The leather wallet was worn. He was a grinder. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about the events at Thorne Logistics." I looked at him. I looked at the dark sedan parked behind my truck. "Come in, Agent Miller," I said, unlatching the screen. "It's cold out there." We sat on the back porch. It was enclosed, heated by a small space heater that hummed like a contented cat. I motioned for him to sit at the small glass table. I didn't offer him coffee. Coffee is for business. I offered him lemonade. "It's fresh," I said, pouring from a glass pitcher. The ice clinked against the sides, a cheerful summer sound in the dead of winter. I have a lot of time for kitchen tasks these days. Miller didn't drink. He stared at the glass, then at me. "Mr. Thorne, your children are currently being held at the Federal Detention Center without bail. They are facing charges of money laundering, RICO conspiracy, and grand larceny." "I know," I said. I took a sip of my own drink. The tartness made my jaw ache. "I watched the news." "The news," Miller repeated, his voice flat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mr. Thorne, you ran that company for 40 years. 40 years. And in that time, we never had a reason to look at you twice. You were a pillar of the community." I tried to be. "And yet," he continued, his eyes narrowing, 72 hours after you hand over the keys, the place turns into a distribution hub for the Syndicate. A truck full of contraband is seized. 2 known enforcers are arrested in your lobby. And the books show a 20-year history of unexplained revenue that suddenly stopped." He let the silence hang. He was waiting for me to fidget, to sweat, to ask for a lawyer. I picked up a napkin and dabbed my lip. "It is a tragedy," I said. Miller slammed his hand on the table. The lemonade jumped in the glass. "Don't give me that. You think I buy this? You think I believe that your son, a kid who wears slip-on shoes because he can't be bothered to tie laces, masterminded a multi-million-dollar laundering operation over a weekend? You built this engine, Elijah. They just crashed it." He was smart. He saw the shape of the thing, but he couldn't see the screws. "You give me too much credit, Agent," I said softly, "and you give my children too little." I reached down to the floor, to a leather satchel I had placed there before he arrived. I pulled out a folder. It wasn't the thick exit package. It was a slender file containing copies. "You have questions about how the company was run," I said, sliding the folder across the glass table. "I have answers, but they are likely not the ones you want." Miller opened the folder. The first page was the minutes from the emergency board meeting held 3 months ago. I had highlighted the relevant section in yellow. "Motion to remove CEO Elijah Thorne due to cognitive decline and failure to modernize. Vote unanimous. Mr. Thorne is to be stripped of all operational authority immediately. His reliance on archaic tracking methods and refusal to implement digital auditing has endangered the company's future." Miller read it. His jaw tightened. "They pushed you out," he said. "They staged a coup," I corrected. "They told the board I was senile. They told them I was a hoarder, an obstacle." I flipped the page for him. "The indemnification clause. Read Section 8, I said. Miller read. I watched his eyes track the lines. I saw the moment the realization hit him. The legal firewall, the absolute absolution of Elijah Thorne from all past, present, and future liability, drafted by Caleb's own expensive lawyers, signed and notarized. "They assumed full liability," Miller whispered. "They wanted to scrub the history. They wanted a blank slate." I said. They told my systems were heavy. They said I didn't understand modern finance. They wanted to optimize the revenue streams.
I leaned back in my chair. The wicker creaked. I tried to warn them, Agent Miller. I told them the logistics were complex. I told them not to change the schedules. But when you are told by your own flesh and blood that you are a dinosaur, that you are too old to understand the world, I let my voice trail off. I looked out the window at the gray sky. I let the grief show, not the grief for the crime, but the grief for the betrayal. It was the only honest emotion I had left to give him. Perhaps they were right, I said. I didn't know about the Orion Group. I thought we were just shipping auto parts. Maybe I was too old. Maybe I missed the signs. Miller looked at me. He looked at the documents. He looked at the lemonade. He knew. He knew I was lying. He knew I had built the maze and then handed my children a map that led straight to the Minotaur. He knew that the cognitive decline was a performance. But he was an agent of the law, and the law requires paper. My paper said I was a victim. My paper said I was incompetent. My paper said I was innocent.
You set them up, Miller said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation spoken in the quiet privacy of a porch where no recording devices were running. I retired, I said. I signed the papers they put in front of me. Is that a crime, Agent? Miller stood up. He closed the folder, but he didn't take it. He didn't need it. He had the originals in the evidence locker downtown. He just hadn't read them with the right context until now. You're going to let them rot in there, he said. Your own kids. They are safe in there, I said. The words slipped out before I could catch them. Miller paused. He caught the inflection. Safe from whom? I took another sip of lemonade. Safe from themselves, Agent. Safe from their own ambition. Miller stared at me for a long moment. He looked at the hard lines of my face, the steady hands, the eyes that didn't blink. He realized then that he wasn't talking to a businessman. He was talking to a survivor. We'll be watching you, Mr. Thorne, he said. If you spend a dime of that money. I live on a pension, I said, and I grow tomatoes. He turned and walked to the door. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out into the cold, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He got into his sedan and sat there for a minute, likely gripping the steering wheel, screaming in frustration. I watched him drive away. He had the truth, but he didn't have the proof. I was alone on the porch. The heat spader hummed. The lemonade was watered down now. The ice melted. I picked up the folder and placed it back in the satchel. The defense held. The fortress was secure. But the house was very, very quiet. I had won the game. I had checkmated the feds and the syndicate in a single move. But as I looked at the empty chair where my son should have been sitting, asking for advice, I realized the board was empty. I had cleared the deck. I stood up, my joints stiff. I had one last thing to do, one last ritual to close the book. I needed to go to the garden. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a 3-inch blanket of white silence over the world. It was the kind of cold that clarifies things, sharp, biting, and absolute. I put on my heavy canvas coat and the thick leather gloves that had shaped the steering wheels of a dozen trucks before they ever touched a garden tool. I walked out the back door. The house behind me was a tomb. The phone had finally stopped ringing. The reporters had packed up their vans and moved on to the next tragedy, leaving only tire tracks in the slush at the end of the driveway. The company was gone. In the span of a week, the federal government had done what no competitor could do in 40 years. They had stripped the carcass clean. The trucks were impounded, sitting in a government lot like a herd of sleeping elephants. The warehouse on 4th Street, my last leverage, my secret keep, was wrapped in yellow tape, its doors sealed with padlocks that didn't belong to me. The Synergy blue paint was likely already cracking in the frost. Liquidation. It was a sterile word for a massacre. I walked to the garden beds at the edge of the property. This was Eleanor's domain. In the summer, it was a riot of tomatoes, peppers, and snap peas. Now, it was a grid of brown stalks and white snow. I knelt down. My knees protested, a sharp grind of bone on bone, but I ignored it. I brushed the snow away from the soil of the center bed. The earth was hard, frozen near the surface, but dark and loamy underneath. I dug my gloved fingers into the dirt. Caleb and Simone were safe. That was the paradox that kept me sleeping at night. They were currently sitting in individual cells in the federal detention center downtown. No bail. The prosecutor had argued they were flight risks, citing the offshore accounts I had planted the breadcrumbs for. They were in 23-hour lockdown. Solitary. To the world, it was a punishment. To me, it was a fortress. The Syndicate could reach many places. They could reach a penthouse apartment. They could reach a yacht in the Caribbean. They could certainly reach a minimum security camp. But they could not reach a suspect in federal protective custody in a maximum security holding facility. The walls were too thick. The eyes were too many. My children were in a cage, yes, but the lions couldn't get through the bars. They hated me right now. I knew this with the certainty of gravity. Caleb was likely pacing his cell, blaming my senility, blaming the old systems, blaming the unfairness of the universe. Simone was probably sitting on her bunk, calculating the years of her sentence, realizing that her MBA didn't cover RICO statutes.
They would never know that the alternative was a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens. They would never know that the inefficiency they mocked was the only shield that had held back the darkness for 2 decades. I found what I was looking for, a bindweed root. It was dead on the surface, a withered brown string, but I knew the truth. Underneath, the root was white, fleshy and alive. It was drinking from the soil, waiting for spring to choke the life out of anything I tried to plant. I gripped it near the base. You wanted the crown, I whispered to the frozen ground. You wanted the weight. I pulled. The earth resisted. It held on to the weed with a stubborn grip. I thought of the day I signed the incorporation papers in 1985. I thought of the first time Mr. Gray walked into my office offering a solution to a payroll crisis that would have shuttered the doors. I thought of the first time I looked the other way. We do these things to build a roof over our heads, telling ourselves we will fix the foundation later. But the foundation never gets fixed. It just gets buried deeper.
The root snapped. I held the severed white tendril in my hand. It was ugly. It was tough. It was a parasite, but it had a right to live, didn't it? It was just doing what it was designed to do. Just like me. I tossed the weed onto the pile of snow. It landed with a soft pat. I stood there in the freezing wind, looking at the empty garden, and for the first time, the certainty cracked. I told myself I did it to save them. That was the narrative I built to sleep at night. The cage is better than the coffin. It's a clean equation. Logic over sentiment. But logic is a cold blanket. I looked back at the house. It was massive, dark, and silent. It was a monument to 40 years of secrets. Could I have stopped it earlier? The question hit me harder than the cold.
10 years ago, when Caleb first came to work, full of bright ideas and arrogance, what if I had sat him down? What if instead of hiding the red ledger in the safe, I had opened it on the desk and said, look at where the money comes from. Look at the blood on your tuition checks. He would have been horrified. He would have judged me. He might have hated me then, but he would be free. He might have walked away. He might have become a teacher or an artist or anything other than a CEO of a haunted company. Simone might have left the state. They would have disowned me, perhaps. They would have refused the dirty money, but they wouldn't be in a federal cell wearing orange jumpsuits. I didn't keep the secret to protect them. I kept the secret because I was ashamed and because I liked the way they looked at me, like I was a titan of industry, not a bagman for the mob. I let them walk into the trap because I was too cowardly to dismantle it while they were watching. I saved their lives, yes, but I stole their choices. I treated them like assets to be managed, like liabilities to be indemnified, not like people who deserved the truth. I saved you, I whispered to the wind, but the wind didn't answer. And I knew that tonight, when Caleb stared at the ceiling of his cell and Simone curled up on her cot, they weren't thanking God for their survival. They were cursing the name Thorne. I had won the game against the Syndicate. I had beaten the feds. I was the last man standing on the board. But standing alone isn't a victory. It's a sentence. I looked at my hands. They were stained dark with wet earth. They looked dirty. No amount of scrubbing would ever get them truly clean again. I didn't feel like planting tomatoes anymore. I turned and walked back toward the house. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing me in. I walked to the living room and sat in my chair, in the dark, listening to the silence I had bought at the price of my children's freedom. It wasn't peace. It was just quiet. and I would have a long, long time to think about the difference.